Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at UC San Diego. My name is Steve Clary. I am the chair of the curriculum committee, and I am substituting this morning for my Osher colleague, Mavis Porter, who normally hosts this wonderful series in which our members, of which have an amazing record of accomplishment, experience, and interests, address their colleagues on a subject of interest or in their area of expertise. And we're very, very pleased to welcome back to, quote, the podium, quote unquote, this morning, Dr. Joel Dimsdale, who is a distinguished psychiatrist, emeritus at the UC San Diego and Harvard faculties. And Joel is a regular speaker here. He has spoken to us most provocatively about the Nazi war criminals, and recently on mind-altering drugs. And we're going to begin a session today of part of his new book on the subject of brainwashing during the early days and of the Cold War. Looking at the early days of the Cold War and then at the Korean War in particular with the POWs. I mentioned Joel's background briefly. Will be lecturing again tomorrow, I believe, and also in the fall when he will discuss remaining parts of his book. So Joel, thanks as always for engaging with us, your colleagues, and we wish you the very best. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve, very much for the introduction, and it's fun to be back speaking at Osher again. As you mentioned, this talk is part of my Dark Persuasion lecture series. And in the past year or so, I've spoken to Osher about how brainwashing developed in the 20th century. And we discussed the Patty Hearst case. We have also discussed truth serum and drugs of interrogation, and also Heaven's Gate. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So my new book on the history of brainwashing will be out in mid-August. But today, it'll be the first of a two-part series talking about early Cold War and brainwashing, and also tomorrow, talking extensively about what happened in Korea. Because it was in Korea that the term brainwashing first appeared. I'll focus on the run-up to the Korean War today. Today we'll discuss the enormous controversy about brainwashing that emerged during and after the Korean War. To help you follow along, I've split this lecture into 4 segments. Definitional problems sound boring, but they're not in this instance. Brainwashing is a very slippery term, and the core of the phenomenon involves something along the lines of persuasion, but it's much more than persuasion. Brainwashing shares a certain amount of territory with religious conversion, and that doesn't define brainwashing either, particularly when you come to secular manifestations of conversion. Torture also can elicit confessions and certain behaviors, but it doesn't necessarily change one's belief. Same thing for drugs that may help people become more tractable, but are hardly able to touch their personal beliefs. The essence of brainwashing is some sort of coercive persuasion or forcible indoctrination. At the end of this lecture, I will be asking you to review one of the sentinel legal cases of the 20th century to decide for yourself if the defendant had been brainwashed. When World War II ended and peace came in 1945, the world breathed a sigh of relief, but it was a short sigh. Even as the surrender discussions were underway, the former allies were preparing for a different type of war with each other, not a worldwide conflagration, but more of an unremitting battle of ideology and doctrine, punctuated by smaller wars. Today, I'll be focusing on brainwashing in the context of the early Cold War years from 1944 to 1945. Virtually from the moment World War II ended, the former Allies viewed the world as a vast arena for a continuing struggle. Stalin had proclaimed, in order to eliminate the inevitability of war, it is necessary to abolish imperialism, because democratic institutions are, after all, only the moderate wing of fascism. Churchill proclaimed, I shudder to visualize what is actually happening to millions now and what is going to happen. A shadow has fallen, an iron curtain has descended. The Soviets seized Central and Eastern Europe, and all over the world, the Soviets and Americans faced off with proxy wars and efforts to destabilize each other's supporting regimes. By the late 1940s, the Cold War spanned the world. The world was poised on the razor's edge, with NATO and the Western allies shown in shades of blue, opposed by the Soviet Union and its allies shown in shades of red. The green areas represented Western colonies in the early 1950s, and the gray areas represent non-aligned countries. The West called the Soviets brutal and totalitarian, and the Soviets called the West imperialists and racists. The Cold War was not just about empire, land, and trade. It was also a war of doctrines, pitting liberal democracy against communism. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal once mused that he wasn't sure if we were confronting an enemy nation or a religion. In other words, the Cold War was a battle of beliefs where the goal was conversion of the enemy. Not surprisingly, this long-running battle triggered a burgeoning interest in the art of persuasion. To understand how brainwashing developed, it's helpful to review some of the early developments of the Cold War. I'll provide a capsule summary of the early Cold War years before turning to the case at hand. In 1945, Berlin fell, President Roosevelt died, the atom bomb was dropped on Japan, and Japan surrendered. The Soviets occupied Central and Eastern Europe. An extensive Soviet spy ring was exposed in Canada, and American discoveries followed thereafter with revelations about Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. Britain's intelligence service was similarly compromised. In 1946, Churchill proclaimed that an iron curtain had descended. Stalin opined that communism and capitalism are incompatible. America invoked the domino theory for the first time to justify intervention in Greece and Turkey. There were confrontations throughout the world, in Iran, Dutch East Indies, Latvia, and French Indochina. Note the emotional tone of this illustration. A peaceful Uncle Sam out for an excursion, but being confronted by an ominous red iceberg with tombstones of North Korea, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc. By 1947, there was concern that communism would take over the world. Truman asked for funds to battle aggression in the Balkans. We began the Voice of America, and the temporary OSS became the permanent Central Intelligence Agency. The House Un-American Activities Committee begins hearings trying to ferret out hidden communists. In 1948, the Russians blockade Berlin. They begin jamming Voice of America, and they stage a coup in Czechoslovakia. In 1949, things heat up considerably more. The Russians got their atom bomb, and Mao was victorious in China. The West formed NATO and ended the Berlin blockade. In Hungary, a peculiar trial takes place that rivets worldwide attention, and we'll return to that. In 1950, the Korean War begins. The Rosenbergs are arrested for treason, and the McCarthy hearings continue a frenzied search for communists. Lest any of you are nostalgic for the peaceful days of the 1950s, let me remind you of the news. The early 1950s revealed further hidden spies, more coups. The overwhelming perception was, as Truman put it, we are in the shadow of another world war. This image captures the fear of America under communism, a country burning down in violence, race war, and rape. I mention all this because one needs to recall the profound anxiety of the times to understand how brainwashing emerged. In addition to the discovery of numerous nests of spies on both sides, there was the riveting problem of communists abducting hostages. Even today, hostage taking is not rare. Every year, approximately 200 Americans are held hostage somewhere in the world, typically for money or revenge. But in the early Cold War years, the goal wasn't money, but rather to seize the enemy, spirit him away, and persuade him to confess or defect to the other side. These abductions were by no means limited to Europe, but took place widely in Japan and South Korea, and even in the United States. In their own way, these abductions were upsetting reminders that the enemy was lurking everywhere. The world became preoccupied with coercive persuasion during the trial of a Catholic cardinal in Hungary. In the 20th century, Hungary repeatedly lurched politically, and after World War II, it was firmly in communist hands, anxious to throttle any remaining Nazi sympathizers in the country. I was a Cold War child growing up in Iowa in the 1940s and 1950s. Stalin's show trials were a thing of the past, and the world was recovering from a war where the goal was elimination of the enemy. The Cold War, on the other hand, aimed at conversion of the enemy. I have shadowy memories of one of those Cold War instances where brainwashing was invoked. I can still see in my mind's eye the Hungarian Cardinal Joseph Mindzhenty peering out of the American embassy balcony. Perhaps you recall this as well. Cardinal Mindszenty was an Austro-Hungarian nationalist and rigidly conservative Catholic leader. He had been repeatedly arrested by the left and the right because he opposed any form of totalitarianism or interference with the Catholic Church. The Nazis imprisoned him during their reign. He got out of prison when the Nazis were overthrown, but his freedom didn't last long. When the communists took over, they tortured him for months before putting him on trial in a famous show trial in 1949 and sentencing him to life imprisonment. His communist detention lasted 7 years, with 4 of those in solitary confinement. Look closely at this picture. Look at the faces separated by 3 years. And one starts to wonder what happened to this man. And that's what we will be focusing on. Just before he was apprehended in 1948, he warned his followers that any confession he might make from prison would be a lie because he expected he would be tortured. Before the trial, he was subjected to repeated beatings and sleep deprivation. He was malnourished and lost about 50% of his body weight, and the unceasing screams of other torture victims weighed on him. Nonetheless, he refused to confess. During his interrogations, he swore he'd committed no acts against the people of Hungary. The beatings continued unless the cardinal would sign a confession. He worried about being drugged. He became apathetic and developed visual hallucinations while in solitary. The interrogators told him that unless he confessed, his elderly mother would be brought in for questioning. They alternated between good cop and bad cop, but he adamantly refused to confess. Eventually, they wore him down. What got to him was the solitude. He wrote, "Noise induces nervousness, but the quiet of solitary confinement also destroys the nerves gradually. The prisoner no longer has a watch. It is therefore difficult for him to follow the passage of time. Inactivity makes solitude worse. The greatest torment in prison is the monotony, which sooner or later shatters the nervous system and wears the soul thin." The interrogators demanded that he confess to outlandish crimes, like stealing the Hungarian crown jewels, and they cited distorted passages from his letters as evidence. When they asked him for names of fellow conspirators, Mindszenty hesitantly offered the names of 2 individuals he knew were already dead. That partial confession merely encouraged the interrogators. Eventually, he signed a confession, but appended a curious abbreviation to his signature. After his signature, he added CF, a Latin abbreviation for coactus feci, which means I have been forced to act. It's an old expression used in the Catholic Church for centuries by beleaguered leaders. After months of interrogation, Mindszenty confessed to treason and black market dealings. He was subjected to a 2-day show trial, and his haunted visage disturbed a West that became convinced that here was yet another victim of mysterious communist mind control. In Britain's parliament, members were shocked that the cardinal had confessed to such unlikely charges, and there were murmurings there that the communists must have drugged him. One MP asked, Is not the demeanor of those prisoners in all these trials behind the Eastern Curtain consistent with administration of a drug which paralyzes the will and consciousness? The CIA agreed. Mindszenty's vacant eyes and monotone voice suggested that he was under the influence of some mysterious and mind-bending drug, or that he was standing before the dock in some post-hypnotic trance. No one used the word brainwashing to describe his situation because that word wasn't invented until 1 year later, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But from the press reports and government observations, the conclusion was that something truly remarkable had happened, some instance of mysterious communist influence. I'm not so sure that the Cardinal's confession was the result of some startlingly new form of dark persuasion. After months of harsh treatment, solitary confinement, and torture, it is understandable that someone might succumb to interrogation and confess falsely. Why do we think that people would not? Besides, if he had been successfully brainwashed, would he have added the secret message buried in the signature line of his confession, saying in essence, this confession was obtained only by duress? Finally, the ashen look on his face likely reflected exhaustion. Why invoke that he was a mind-controlled zombie like in the films? He looked exhausted, pained, and drained of energy, not because of black magic, but because he was indeed exhausted, pained, and drugged with concoctions of stimulants and mescaline. There is, however, a germ of truth to the allegations that the Hungarians used a secret communist technique. His tormentors were methodical and patient. They were also prescient in recognizing that sleep deprivation was one of their most powerful tools. When the short-lived Hungarian Revolution broke out in 1956, Mindszenty escaped from prison and obtained asylum in America's embassy. He was fortunate in getting there because the revolution lasted only 3 weeks. He remained locked up in the embassy as a refugee until 1971. It was an uneasy asylum. During his asylum in the embassy, his recurring tirades against communism exasperated the United States, which was attempting some sort of rapprochement with Russia. In some ways, he was like Julian Assange of WikiLeaks fame, who irritated his hosts in the Ecuadorian embassy. After 13 years in the embassy, he was finally allowed to leave in 1971 when he went into exile in Vienna. He died 4 years later, a symbol of defiance, having been jailed by the Nazis during the war, jailed by the communists from 1948 to 1956, and held in an uneasy asylum as the guest of the American embassy from 1956 to 1971. I'll be moving on in a moment to the next chapter of this inquiry about early Cold War years, but I'd like to ask you a favor. If you take your mouse and linger over the reactions key at the bottom of your screen, just indicate whether you thought Cardinal Mindszenty was brainwashed or not. If you thought he was brainwashed, enter the thumbs up key if you thought he was not, enter the thumbs down key, and we'll return to that in discussion. But I think in the meantime, it will be interesting to see the votes come in. So the allegations of some kind of communist dark persuasion were not limited just to Europe. Back in China, Mao's forces had triumphed by 1949, and peculiar stories emerged. There were reports of secret communist techniques of persuasion, and these reports became even more compelling 1 year later when reports started to trickle in from China and then from Korea. There were many Western missionaries, scholars, and reporters who had remained in China during the protracted Chinese Civil War. When Mao's forces eventually won in 1949, these Westerners and many old guard Chinese intellectuals were detained by the new Chinese, Red Chinese. Rumors circulated that the Chinese were using odd methods of interrogation and indoctrination on these prisoners. There are countless autobiographies by those who were detained, but I find the work of Alan and Adele Rickett, Prisoners of Liberation, singularly interesting. The Ricketts were graduate students studying in China when they were imprisoned as spies from 1951 to 1955. But there was something decidedly unusual about how they were treated in custody. The Ricketts were told that the purpose of their imprisonment was not punishment, but re-education. They were to use their time in prison to learn a new outlook on life, to reform their thinking through study and mutual criticism. The detainees were treated harshly and subjected to protracted interrogation and indoctrination. The interrogators told them that intellectuals were not of the people, that they would come to realize their crimes on their own. The Westerners were told that they were stooges of imperialism, who were cloaking their true intentions behind a facade of scholarship. They were asked to write long autobiographies, but whatever they wrote was judged inadequate, and they were forced to start all over again. Any minute discrepancies in the autobiographies were viewed as evidence of lying. Much of this treatment followed Russian strategies of interrogation from the 1920s and 30s, but the Chinese introduced a new weapon of persuasion, group pressure. The detainees were put in small cells or huts with other prisoners and forced to make daily confessions of their crimes. In turn, these confessions were severely criticized by other prisoners. The groups were quick to recognize insincere confessions and were brutally frank. "Who do you think you're gonna fool with that hogwash?" one person was told. Alternately, the communist cadres encouraged open confessions. "What we want to hear is what you honestly think. Nobody has ever been reprimanded here for being honest, but if you lie and hedge and try to pretend to be something you aren't, then we don't like that. You've committed a serious crime, and you better start thinking about whether it was right or wrong. Now, talk it over amongst yourselves." Cut off from the world and with communist propaganda as their only reading material, they were forced to study communist theory and listen to incessant lectures about communism. If one prisoner slacked off, everyone in the cell was punished, thereby assuring constant pressures on each other to comply. After months and sometimes years of such pressure, many confessed and then were banished from China. They gave the world a glimpse of their ordeal through interviews and news stories. Although it was expected that they would renounce their conversions to communism when they got home, some did not. Their views of themselves and the world seemed to change by their experiences in detention. Some even found an appealing quality to the Chinese masses working together to build a better world in comparison to the imperialism and racism of the West. Based on their confessions, Senator McCarthy and his followers threatened them with charges of treason. As a result, many of the former detainees weren't sure where in the world they belonged anymore. Upon their release, the Ricketts were forced to see a psychiatrist and subjected to press conferences where they were barraged with questions. Journalists reported that Adele Ricketts' mind had been twisted out of recognition. Then, a surprising statement. Alan Rickett publicly admitted that, in a sense, his studies in China really were a form of spying, and that all in all, he felt that he'd been treated leniently. This was viewed as further evidence of contemptible cowardice. Why didn't you stay in China if you liked it so much? In addition to the detainees' autobiographies, studies of Chinese prisoners started to emerge. And the most prominent study was that of Air Force psychiatrist Robert Lifton, who interviewed many of the Chinese scholars and Westerners expelled from China in 1951. Based on these extensive interviews, Lifton coined the term thought reform to describe the Chinese techniques of persuasion. While thought reform has similarities to earlier Russian methods, it had a different emphasis. In Russia, confession was followed by purge, exile, or liquidation. In China, the goal of confession was re-education and rehabilitation. Certainly there was coercion, but it was mixed with an evangelistic fervor to wipe out criminal thoughts and establish a new moral code. Lifton likened the thought reform process to a process of dying and being reborn, and characterized these public confessions as ecstatic repentance and histrionic remorse. He suggested that thought reform occurred in phases. Newly arriving Chinese intellectuals were greeted warmly and encouraged to get to know each other. There was a sense of optimism. Then the detainees were taught about the old society's corruption and that they, as intellectuals, had come from such corrupt social classes. They were then encouraged to purge themselves of their past to become part of the new society. The Chinese maintained airtight control of the environment, filtering out what prisoners could learn from the outside world. They manipulated all aspects of the prisoners' lives, demanding purity, confession, and absolute acceptance of their dogma. They used language filled with slogans and dichotomized the world between the people versus the reactionaries. Finally, there was a period of conflict or struggle when prisoners summarized their life history by criticizing themselves and their fellow students, ever on the lookout for the lack of orthodox belief. There was a long list of what to criticize: individualism, subjectivism, objectivism, opportunism, deviationism, all of these defined in jargonistic fashion. As Lifton described it, thought reform led to a compulsion to confess. The more lurid, the better. And it led to revival-like meetings where students rejoiced that the state had washed away all their sins. In his words, confession amounted to atonement and led to redemption. In the end, the thought-reformed prisoner acquired a new identity. But would the new ideas persist after release? Lifton noted that prisoners were stunned and dazed upon release. They staggered out of China with a haunting sense of sadness, confusion about the world, and lingering feelings of guilt and shame. Most of all, they felt like outsiders in their own culture. The POWs from the Korean War had a slightly different experience than the Chinese intellectuals and the Western missionaries. With the Korean POWs, the Chinese resorted to more brutality to soften up the prisoners before trying to convert them. I'll elaborate on those techniques tomorrow when we dive into detail about the American POWs in Korea. But first, I'd like to set the stage in the historical context because the Korean conflict is one of America's most forgotten wars. I'll finish today by introducing the Korean War because that is where the allegations of brainwashing first appeared. But today, I'd like to give an overview of the war itself. Although the Korean conflict is still very much in the news, most people do not recall the details of this war that brought brainwashing into public conversation. America is anomalous because of its large size and long history of stable borders. My friends in Korea tell me they always know where the enemy is coming from, either from Japan or from China. You look at the scale of this map, it's a small area, it's a small country. Seoul is only 35 miles from the border with North Korea. The Korean peninsula dangles from Manchuria, and Manchuria has at various times been part of China to the west or Russia to the north. Because of its geographical setting, the Korean borders have been repeatedly crisscrossed by invading armies. In 1910, China annexed Korea and went on to invade Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937. In those days, China itself was in the throes of civil war that took a back seat during the Japanese occupation. When World War II ended in 1945, Japan's empire was rolled back, the Chinese Civil War resumed, and Mao Zedong was ultimately victorious in 1949. Thereafter, China had a loose and ambivalent relationship with Russia, and Manchuria was divided between Russia and China. Korea was split at the 38th parallel between a northern sector administered by Russia and a southern sector administered by the United States. There was a preposterous idea that Russia and America would stabilize and develop Korea after 35 years of chaotic Japanese occupation, and then the Russians, Americans would depart after peaceful elections took place in Korea. In June 1950, the North Koreans suddenly invaded South Korea and almost succeeded in seizing the entire peninsula. When the front shifted north, Chinese troops flooded across the Manchurian border to assist the North Koreans. It's hard to say which season was hardest for combat, blistering summers with monsoon rains or frigid winters. Throughout the war, the front lurched repeatedly north and south, like a football game with strong offense and poor defense. China in particular and Russia secondarily supported the North. The United States and the United Nations supported the South. As you probably remember, during one phase of the conflict, General MacArthur staged a brilliant offense into the North, so successful that it threatened to escalate the war into a direct war with Russia and China. And President Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination, thereby making more people in America ever obsessed with a perception of our own weakness and the threats of communism. Millions of people were killed in the war. The casualty rate among early prisoners in North Korea was particularly high due to the mountainous terrain and extreme temperatures. The North Koreans had insufficient detention facilities, so they summarily executed many prisoners. The rest were sent north on death marches until they were handed over to the Chinese. Amongst the dead were approximately 36 or 38,000 Americans. Meanwhile, the survivors languished in POW camps for years. There were mysterious rumors of an American germ warfare campaign. After China took control of prisoners and once the ceasefire discussions began in July 1951, the mortality rate of the POWs dropped, but it took 2 more years for an uneasy armistice to be reached in 1953. The Korean conflict was a war for territory and conversion of the enemy. All sides bombarded each other with extensive propaganda campaigns. On the left is an instance of Chinese propaganda, and on the right, an instance of American propaganda posters. The Chinese poster reads, "Why is the American ruling circle busily expanding armaments, disregarding the hardship and misery of the people? It is because their only concern is war and war profits, and not peace and peaceful construction." The American poster is far more succinct. "Why die for China and Russia?" The war dragged on for an extra 2 years, and the POWs languished in the camps whilst armistice negotiations stalled, primarily over the question of allowing captured POWs to choose where they wanted to go upon release. There were enormous pressures from frantic families who worried about their sons in POW camps and were denied a longed-for return and reunion with the family. This question of prisoner repatriation mired the ceasefire negotiations. After any war, it is assumed that prisoners want to return to their home countries. However, after World War II, it was clear that millions of people displaced by the war did not want to return to their homes for various reasons, because their homes were no more, their neighborhoods and towns were no more, and even their countries were no more. Furthermore, there were risks for returning. Many POWs who returned to the Soviet Union were accused of collaboration with the Nazis and shipped off to forced labor in the gulags. President Truman demanded that all POWs be given a choice of where they wished to be repatriated. He knew that many of the North Koreans and Chinese POWs did not wish to be resettled in the North. Their reluctance to return was a potential propaganda disaster for North Korea and China, particularly if the Chinese POWs preferred to resettle in Taiwan or nationalist China. This repatriation issue was enormous. All sides started to persuade captured soldiers to repudiate their home country and defect to the other side. The eventual solution was to impose a 90-day decision period during which prisoners were ostensibly supervised by the United Nations. But in actuality, the prisoners were constantly harangued about repatriating home or defecting. It was a gut-wrenching blow to the United States when some American troops chose to defect to China. What really happened to the prisoners? How did it come about? Many voices described these events and tried to make sense of such decisions. Some voices were shrill and others were more nuanced. The behavior of the prisoners during and after their imprisonment was profoundly galling to the United States government. What had the Chinese done to the American prisoners to make them confess to waging germ warfare and to participate in anti-war propaganda? What's worse, how had the Chinese persuaded a small number of POWs to refuse to return home after the war? Prisoners were also denounced for dishonorably dying in captivity. These events became linked to the idea that prisoners succumbed because American culture was weak and too liberal. Then a magical word appeared. The next lecture will discuss how the concept of brainwashing was developed, how it was distorted and used to buttress ideological positions. But let us return to Cardinal Mindszenty. I'd like to pose two questions to you. Was he brainwashed? And what do you mean by brainwashed?